The sound that ripped through the Silverwood Creek Fair wasn't a scream of joy. It was the splintering of wood, followed by a sound of pure primal terror. One moment, the air was thick with the scent of roasted corn and sweet apple pies. The next, it was filled with dust and panic. A wave of people surged back from the makeshift corral at the edge of the fairgrounds, their faces painted with fear. Stalls toppled, sending handcrafted toys and jars of honey crashing into the dirt. A monster had been unleashed. It was a wild Mustang, a creature of midnight and fury. Its coat was the color of a starless sky, its eyes burning with the fire of a trapped spirit. The handler, a man whose swagger far outstripped his skill, lay groaning in the dust, his whip lying useless beside him. The horse was free, and it was terrified. It reared on its powerful hind legs, hooves slicing through the air like obsidian blades. It was a force of nature, a hurricane of muscle and bone let loose in a town square full of fragile human beings. People scrambled for safety, knocking over children, abandoning their wares, their only thought to escape the path of the charging beast. But one person didn't move. In the middle of the chaos, directly in the Mustang's path, stood a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, frozen solid, his blue eyes wide, not with wonder, but with a paralyzing, all-consuming fear. He was a statue in the center of a stampede, a tiny, helpless target for the 2,000-pound missile of panic thundering toward him. The crowd held its breath. A collective, silent prayer hung in the dusty air. They were about to witness a tragedy. But then something impossible happened. 50 yards away, the swinging doors of the Silverwood Saloon burst open. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the harsh Arizona sun. He was a stranger, a man who had spent the last 3 days shrouded in the corner of the bar, speaking to no one, his face hidden by the brim of a weathered hat. The town had whispered about him. They said he looked like a man running from something. Maybe the law, maybe something worse. He moved without hesitation. Later, no two accounts would be the same. Some would say he moved like lightning, a blur of motion too fast for the eye to follow. Others would swear he didn't run at all, but floated over the ground, untouched by the chaos around him. But everyone agreed on what they saw next, and none of them would ever forget it. The stranger didn't run around the horse. He didn't try to distract it. He ran directly at it. The Mustang was a freight train of destruction. The boy was a fragile doll on the tracks. The stranger was a madman charging headlong into the collision. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. The thundering of hooves became a low, resonant drumbeat. The stranger's long strides ate up the distance, his face a mask of grim determination. He could see the terror in the boy's eyes, the silent scream trapped in his throat. He was just feet from the boy when he launched himself into the air. It wasn't a clumsy tackle. It was a movement of impossible grace, one arm wrapped around the child's waist, pulling him from the ground in a single fluid motion. His other hand shot out, not to strike the horse, but to grasp a fistful of its flying black mane. He didn't fight the horse's momentum. He used it. In a breathtaking display of agility, he used the force of the charging animal to swing both himself and the boy upwards, twisting his body to land squarely on the Mustang's bare back. The crowd let out a single unified gasp. 1 second, the boy was about to be trampled into the dirt. The next, he was riding the very beast that was meant to kill him, held safe in the arms of the silent stranger from the saloon. The horse, shocked by the sudden weight and the unexpected maneuver, didn't stop. It thundered on, carrying its 2 new riders past the wreckage of the fair and toward the edge of town, its wild gallop a testament to the panic still coursing through its veins. The boy, Noah, clung to the stranger, his face buried in the man's dusty coat. The wind whipped past them, stealing his breath, but the terror was gone, replaced by a strange, heart-pounding exhilaration. He could feel the powerful muscles of the horse working beneath him, a living engine of speed and strength. But he also felt the steady, unshakable presence of the man holding him, a shield against the chaos. The stranger leaned forward, his mouth close to the Mustang's ear. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady murmur, words too soft for Noah to understand, carried away by the wind. It wasn't a command, it was a conversation, a plea. An understanding passed between man and beast, And miraculously, the horse began to listen. The frantic, panic-driven gallop eased into a canter. The canter slowed to a powerful trot. The trot gentled into a walk. By the time they reached the cool, clear waters of Silverwood Creek, the wild Mustang was standing still, its sides heaving, sweat glistening on its black coat, but the fire of terror in its eyes had been replaced by a dazed confusion. Only then did the stranger slide from the horse's back, carefully lowering Noah to the ground beside him. The boy's legs felt like jelly, but his eyes never left the man's face. He was looking at something he didn't understand, something that shouldn't be possible. "You all right, son?" the stranger asked. His voice was rough, like gravel, as if he hadn't used it for a long, long time. Noah could only nod, his own voice lost somewhere in his throat. He watched as the man turned back to the horse. The animal trembled, but it didn't pull away as the stranger reached out a hand and stroked its powerful neck, his fingers tracing patterns on the sweat-dampened coat. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice now a soft rumble. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." Moments later, the townspeople arrived, a disorganized posse of worried faces led by the town doctor and the humiliated handler. They stopped dead in their tracks, staring at the impossible scene before them. The wild, untamable Mustang stood as docile as a lamb. Beside it stood the boy who should have been dead. And between them stood the silent, drunken stranger, his hand resting calmly on the animal's flank, the three of them sharing a moment of impossible peace. I ain't never seen anything like it," the handler stammered, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. The stranger didn't even look at him. His focus was entirely on the horse, his quiet murmurs continuing until the animal's breathing steadied completely, its great head dropping in a sign of trust. "That boy could have been killed," someone whispered from the back of the crowd. "Would have been, if not for him," another voice replied, filled with reverence. Noah finally found his voice. It was small but clear as a bell in the sudden quiet. "He saved me," he said simply. The words were small, but they carried the weight of a miracle. The stranger finally turned, his face tight with discomfort under the sudden weight of their attention. "Horse was just scared," he grunted, brushing off the admiration in the boy's eyes as if it were a speck of dust. Anyone would have done the same. But everyone there, from the doctor to the youngest child, knew that was a lie. What they had just witnessed wasn't just courage, it was a mastery, a connection with an animal that bordered on the supernatural. It was a kind of magic they didn't have a name for. As the crowd began to disperse, leading the now calm Mustang back toward the fair, Noah remained. He looked up at the stranger, his blue eyes searching the man's shadowed face. "Thank you, mister," he said again, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. The stranger just gave a curt nod, his shoulders already turning back toward the town, back toward the saloon and the half-empty bottle he'd left on the table. He had done what his instincts demanded, and now he wanted nothing more than to retreat back into the shadows. But something in the boy's gaze, a familiar shade of blue that echoed in the deepest, most painful corners of his memory, made him pause. "Be more careful next time," he said, his voice more gruff than he intended. Then he walked away, his shoulders hunched as if against a sudden chill, leaving the boy standing alone by the creek. He was running again, not from the law, not from a fight, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. The Rusty Spur Saloon was usually a place of loud talk and easy laughter. But when the stranger pushed through the swinging doors that evening, a hush fell over the room. The whispers died. The card games paused. Every eye in the place turned to him. Word of his impossible feat at the fair had spread like a brush fire. The quiet, solitary drunk in the corner was no longer just a mystery. He was a legend, a hero. He hated it. He ignored the stares, the nudges, the odd glances. He made his way to his usual corner table, the one shrouded in the deepest shadows. To his annoyance, a fresh, unopened bottle of whiskey was waiting for him. "Compliments of the house," the bartender called out from behind the bar. There was a new respect in his voice, a deference that hadn't been there that morning. The stranger just touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more dismissal than acknowledgement. He hadn't wanted their whiskey. He hadn't wanted their attention. He had come to Silverwood Creek to be invisible, to drown himself in anonymity. And in one impulsive, instinct-driven moment, He had shattered it completely. He poured a glass, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. For 7 years, he had carefully built a wall around himself. For 7 years, he had been Thomas Reynolds, a drifter with no past. He had worked tirelessly to bury the man he used to be, the man named Thomas Blackwood. Now, one heroic act threatened to bring it all crumbling down. He drank deep, hoping the familiar burn would erase the image that haunted him, the image of the boy's face, those eyes, those piercingly blue eyes. They were so achingly familiar. They had stirred a part of him he'd thought long dead and buried, a grief he had spent nearly a decade trying to outrun. He stared into his glass, but he didn't see the whiskey. He saw a small ranch house outside of Denver. He saw a little boy's room, filled with wooden animals he had carved himself. He saw a tiny body, burning with a fever that no doctor could break. 7 years ago, he had held his son James, as life slipped away from him. For 3 days and 3 nights, he had bargained with God, with the devil, with anyone who would listen. On the fourth morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, James had opened his eyes one last time. They were clear blue, the color of a summer sky. And then they were gone. The grief had been a physical thing, a monster that had clawed its way inside him and hollowed him out. It had turned him into a stranger, a man his wife, Eleanor, could no longer recognize. He had tried to drown the monster in whiskey, to fight it with anger, to outrun it across the vast, empty frontier. But the monster was always there. So he had left. He had walked away from his home, from his wife, from the ghost of his son. He had abandoned Eleanor to face her own grief, alone. He raised the glass to his lips again. 7 years of running, and now the ghost of his son's eyes was staring at him from the face of a stranger's child. "Mister," the voice was small, hesitant, cutting through his dark memories. Thomas looked up. The boy, Noah, was standing beside his table, his small hands twisting the brim of a worn cap. The entire saloon was watching them. "Saloon's no place for a child," Thomas said, his voice flat and cold. He hoped the boy would take the hint and leave him to his ghosts. But Noah didn't move. "Mrs. Donovan says I need to thank you proper, for saving my life." The name snagged Thomas's attention. Martha Donovan, the stern, no-nonsense woman who ran the boarding house where he'd taken a room. She was a woman who minded her own business, a quality he had appreciated. Apparently, he'd been wrong. "You already thanked me," he replied, his hand reaching for the whiskey bottle. "Go on home now." "I can't," Noah said. There was a surprising firmness in his voice, a resolve that seemed too old for his small frame. "Not until I do what I came to do." Thomas let out a weary sigh. The boy was relentless. He felt the eyes of the entire town on him, and it made his skin crawl. He resigned himself to the conversation. "And what's that?" Noah took a deep breath, his blue eyes locking onto Thomas's. "I want to ask if you'd adopt me, just for a day." The request was so bizarre, so utterly unexpected, that Thomas nearly choked on his whiskey. The low murmur of the saloon died completely. You could have heard a pin drop. "Adopt you?" he repeated, his voice a low growl. He was certain he'd misheard. Noah nodded, his expression deadly serious. "Just for one day. I want you to teach me how to be a real cowboy, like you." There was an earnestness in the boy's plea that was disarming, a raw hope that cut straight through Thomas's carefully constructed walls of indifference. But the request was insane. He was a drunk, a drifter, a man running from his own shadow. The last thing he was qualified to be was a father figure, even for a single day. "That's not how adoption works, kid," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "And I'm not looking to be anyone's father. Not temporary, not otherwise." He saw a flicker of pain in the boy's eyes, a shadow that went deeper than simple disappointment. "I just thought—" Noah began, his voice trailing off as he looked down at his worn boots. Thomas should have felt relief. He should have been glad the boy was giving up. Instead, an unfamiliar and unwelcome pang of something that felt dangerously like guilt twisted in his gut. He tried to fight it, to push it down with another swallow of whiskey. "Where are your folks?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. He hated himself for asking. He didn't want to know. He didn't want to care. Don't have any, Noah said, his voice matter of fact. He wasn't looking for pity, he was just stating a fact. My ma died a while back. Never knew my pa. The words were like a knife in Thomas's chest. An orphan, just like his own son James was now, in a way, a boy without a father. The parallel was too close, too painful. He drained his glass in one go, the burn of the whiskey a welcome distraction. Mrs. Donovan takes good care of me, Noah continued, seeming to sense the shift in Thomas's mood. But she can't teach me how to ride, or rope, or any of the things a boy should know. There are plenty of men in this town who could teach you those things, Thomas shot back, his voice harsh. He was desperate to end this conversation, to push the boy and his haunting blue eyes away. Not like you, Noah insisted, his voice unwavering. I saw you, with that Mustang, the way you saved me. Mrs. Donovan says you've got a gift. Thomas snorted, the sound humorless and sharp. Mrs. Donovan talks too much. Please, mister, Noah pressed, leaning forward. The desperation in his eyes was a raw, open wound. Just one day, that's all I'm asking. Thomas felt his composure cracking. Why was this boy so persistent? Why him? He slammed his empty glass down on the table, the sound making the bartender jump. Why? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Why me? Why now? Noah hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of something that looked like fear crossed his face. He glanced around the silent saloon, then back at Thomas, and his expression hardened with a strange resolve. Because time's running out, he said. His voice was so quiet Thomas had to strain to hear it. Before Thomas could ask what he meant, before he could process the chilling finality in the boy's words, Noah reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased with age. He placed it on the table between them. Here, Noah said, his voice regaining its strange firmness. This belongs to you, I think. Thomas stared at the paper. It looked old, fragile. A part of him, the part that had been running for 7 years, screamed at him not to touch it. What is it? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Something that might help you understand, Noah replied. The words were cryptic, filled with a hidden meaning that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand up. Then with a small, formal nod that seemed utterly out of place for a child, the boy turned and walked out of the saloon. He didn't look back. He left Thomas alone at the table, the entire saloon staring at him, the mysterious letter lying between him and the whiskey bottle like a ticking bomb. For what felt like an eternity, Thomas didn't move. He stared at the folded paper, his mind racing. It was a trick, a trap, some kind of blackmail. The boy was working with someone who knew his past. That had to be it. He reached for the whiskey bottle, his hands shaking slightly. He would pour another drink and another, until he forgot about the boy and his strange request and the goddamn piece of paper on his table. But he couldn't. Curiosity, that fatal human weakness, was a hook in his gut. Against every instinct for self-preservation he had honed over 7 long years. He reached out and picked up the paper. His fingers, calloused from years of hard living, fumbled as he unfolded the yellowed sheet. And then his blood ran cold. The handwriting. He would know it anywhere. It was delicate, yet firm, each letter formed with a precise and familiar grace. It was the same handwriting that had filled the love letters he'd kept in his saddlebag during the war. The same handwriting that had been on the deed to their small ranch. It was Eleanor's handwriting. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of panic and disbelief. How? How could this be? He hadn't seen or heard from his wife in 7 years. He had made sure of it. His eyes scanned the words. The ink faded but still legible. My dearest Thomas, if you are reading this, then perhaps there is still hope. Hope that the man I loved, the man I married, still exists somewhere beneath the grief that claimed him. I have written so many letters over the years, none of which ever found their way to you. Perhaps this one will be different. I want you to know that I never blamed you for leaving. Grief changes us in ways we cannot predict or control. When we lost James, I lost you as well. And though that second loss nearly broke me, I understood it. You could not bear to remain in a place filled with reminders of what we had lost. But Thomas, in running from your pain, You also ran from the possibility of healing, of finding joy again, even amid the sorrow, and you ran from knowledge that might have changed everything. The letter ended there, abruptly, incomplete. Thomas stared at the last line, the words burning into his mind. Knowledge that might have changed everything. What knowledge? What could she possibly mean? And the most important question of all, the one that made his throat go dry with a terrifying premonition. How did an orphan boy in a forgotten town called Silverwood Creek get his hands on a letter from a woman he hadn't seen in 7 years? He folded the letter with trembling hands and slid it into his coat pocket. It felt heavy, like a stone. He threw a few coins on the table, more than enough to cover his drinks, and strode out of the saloon, leaving behind a room full of unanswered questions and stunned silence. The cool night air did nothing to calm the turmoil in his mind. He walked through the dusty main street, his boots kicking up small puffs of moonlit dust. He wasn't heading for the open road. He wasn't running anymore. He was walking toward the boarding house at the end of the street, toward the woman named Martha Donovan, and toward the boy with his dead son's eyes. He needed answers, and he had a sinking feeling he wasn't going to like them. The boarding house was quiet. A single lamp burned in the front parlor, casting a warm, inviting glow that felt like a lie. Thomas found Martha Donovan in her rocking chair, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, soothing rhythm that did nothing to soothe the storm inside him. She looked up as he entered, her face, a roadmap of wrinkles, revealing nothing. "Evening, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice calm. She used the fake name, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that told him the charade was over. "Heard you had quite an eventful day." Thomas ignored the pleasantries. He was past that. He walked to the center of the room, his shadow long and menacing in the lamplight. "The boy," he said, his voice a low growl. "Noah. He gave me something. A letter. I need to know where he got it." Martha's needles stopped clicking. She placed her half-finished scarf in her lap, her hands still. "He's asleep now," she said, her tone careful. "It's late. Growing boys need their rest." "I'm not here to disturb him," Thomas shot back, his patience worn thin. "I'm here for answers. From you." She studied him for a long, silent moment. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and they seemed to see right through the years of grime and whiskey to the man he had once been. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "Come with me," she said, rising from her chair with a surprising agility. "There are things we should discuss in private." She led him not to his room, but to a small study at the back of the house. It was lined with books, the air thick with the smell of old paper and leather. She closed the door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt final, like the door of a cell. "Noah has a gift," she began, her voice taking on a new seriousness. She sat in a large leather armchair by the cold fireplace, gesturing for him to take the one opposite. "He sees people for who they truly are, not who they pretend to be." "He gave me a letter from my wife," Thomas said bluntly, cutting through her cryptic preamble. "A woman he couldn't possibly know." Martha nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this. His mother left him with certain belongings, things she wanted him to have when the time was right. A cold dread began to creep up Thomas's spine. "His mother?" he repeated, the words feeling thick in his mouth. "And who was she?" Martha's gaze was steady, unwavering, and filled with a profound sadness. "I think you already know the answer to that question, Mr. Blackwood." The name, his real name. Hearing it spoken aloud after so long was like a physical blow. He stiffened, his body tensing for a fight or for flight. His eyes darted to the door. "Oh, sit down," Martha said, her voice laced with a weary exasperation. "If I intended to turn you in, I'd have sent for the sheriff the day you arrived." He remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. "How?" he demanded. "How do you know that name?" "I was a nurse during the war," she replied, her voice distant, lost in a memory. "I patched up more boys than I can count. Most faces fade, but some you never forget, especially the face of the young cavalryman who could gentle the wildest horses with just a whisper." The memory hit him like a ghost. Fort Laramie, the chaos of the medical tent, the smell of blood and antiseptic, and a stern, kind-faced nurse who had changed his bandages. "You were there," he breathed, the realization dawning on him. "For 3 years," she confirmed. "The officers called you a hoarse whisperer. The men just said you were blessed. I see that blessing hasn't left you." "That was a different man, a different lifetime," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but the man who saved that boy today, that was the man I remember. Not the ghost who's been hiding in the bottom of a whiskey bottle at the Rusty Spur." He sank into the chair, the fight going out of him. He was trapped. There was no running from this. He steered the conversation back to the one thing that mattered. "The letter. Noah's mother. You're saying she was my wife? Eleanor?" "Eleanor," Martha confirmed with a sad nod. "Yes. Noah's mother spoke of her often." The room seemed to tilt. "You knew her?" "No," Martha clarified, and the distinction was crucial. "I never met Eleanor Blackwood. I knew the woman who arrived in Silverwood Creek last winter. A woman desperately ill, carrying a sick child and a small box of letters. A woman who entrusted that child to my care just days before she died." Thomas's mouth went dry. It wasn't making sense. "Eleanor? Dead? Here? It couldn't be. What was her name, he asked, his voice cracking. A part of him, the part that had been running for 7 years, already knew the answer. Knew it from the moment he had first looked into Noah's eyes. Martha hesitated, her gaze softening with a mixture of pity and resolve. "I think," she said gently, "that's a question better answered by what she left behind." She rose and walked to a heavy wooden desk in the corner. From a chain around her neck, she produced a small, ornate key. She unlocked the bottom drawer and withdrew a wooden box. It was dark, polished wood, smooth with age. "She made me promise," Martha said, her voice low and reverent, "to keep this safe, to give it to her son when the time was right. Or, if his father ever came looking." She placed the box in Thomas's hands. It was heavier than it looked, weighted with the secrets of a life he had thrown away. "I believe," she said, her eyes meeting his, "that time has come." She gave him one last look, a look that held 7 years of unspoken sorrow, and then she left him alone in the study. The soft click of the door closing behind her echoed in the silence. He was alone with the box, alone with the ghosts of his past. For a long time, he just sat there staring at it. The box was a Pandora's box of pain. He knew it. He could walk out. He could get on his horse and ride until Silverwood Creek was just a bad memory. He could go back to being Thomas Reynolds, the ghost in the corner. It would be easier, safer. But Eleanor's words from the incomplete letter echoed in his head. Knowledge that might have changed everything. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like his first in 7 years, he reached for the simple brass clasp. His fingers were clumsy, shaking. He lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was a photograph, a daguerreotype in a small, tarnished silver frame. He picked it up, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was Eleanor. She was older, her face etched with lines of hardship he didn't recognize. But it was her, the same gentle smile, the same kind eyes. But there was a new strength in her gaze, a resilience he had never seen before. A resilience born of surviving alone. And standing beside her, his small hand resting on her shoulder, was a little boy. A boy with a serious expression and a familiar, determined set to his jaw. A boy with piercing blue eyes. Noah. Thomas's breath hitched in his throat. His hands trembled so violently he almost dropped the picture. It was impossible. A trick of the light. A coincidence. It had to be. He set the photograph aside and reached for the next item. A small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. He recognized the ribbon. It was the one Eleanor had worn in her hair on their wedding day. He untied the knot, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. Each envelope was addressed to him, Mr. Thomas Blackwood, but none of them had ever been mailed. He pulled one from the stack at random. The date on it was from almost 6 years ago. He carefully broke the seal. April 18th, 1880. My dearest Thomas, spring has come again to our little valley. The wildflowers you always loved are blooming on the hillside, And I found myself thinking of the day you proposed, surrounded by those same blossoms. How young we were then, how certain that love would shield us from all hardship. I wonder where you are now, if you see the same stars I do when night falls. I wonder if you still think of us, of me and of James. And I wonder if you ever think of the child you don't know. Thomas stopped reading. The words blurred. The child you don't know. He read the line again, and then a third time, willing it to mean something else. He continued reading, his heart turning to ice. Our son grows stronger each day, despite the doctor's concerns. He has your way with animals, Thomas. That same gentle touch, that same quiet patience. Yesterday I found him in the barn, talking to your old mare as though they were having a proper conversation. She listened too, her head bent close to his small form. I saw you in him so clearly it nearly broke my heart anew. He asked about you today. What can I tell him? That his father was the kindest, bravest man I ever knew, until grief turned him into a stranger? That you left before I could even tell you I was carrying him? I have chosen instead to tell him stories of your goodness, of your strength. He deserves to know the man you truly are, beneath the pain that drove you away. I keep writing these letters, though I have no address to send them to. Perhaps one day you'll return, and I can give them to you then. Or perhaps they are merely my way of keeping you present in our lives, a conversation that exists only on paper. With enduring love, Eleanor Thomas lowered the letter, a sound escaping his throat that was half sob, half gasp. Unwelcome tears, the first he had shed since James died, burned his eyes. A son. He had a second son. A son who was born after he left. A son he had abandoned without even knowing he existed. The weight of it was crushing, a physical force that stole the air from his lungs. For 7 years he had mourned the one son he had lost. Now he was faced with the ghost of the son he had never known. Noah, the boy he had saved, the boy who had asked him for one day. His son. His hands shaking, he reached back into the box. His fingers brushed past a child's drawing, rendered in charcoal. It showed 3 stick figures, a tall man in a cowboy hat, a woman with long hair, and between them, holding their hands, a small boy. Scrawled across the bottom in childish printing were 2 words. My family. Thomas closed his eyes. The drawing was a more damning indictment than any court of law could ever deliver. He was a failure, not just as a husband, but as a father, twice over. He had run from the ghost of one son, only to stumble blindly into the path of another. A son who had grown up hearing stories of a hero, not knowing his father was a broken coward hiding in a bottle. There was one last item in the box, nestled in a corner on a bed of faded velvet. A simple gold band, a wedding ring. Eleanor's ring. He had buried his own in the woods behind their house the day he left. He picked it up, the metal cool against his skin. He needed to find Martha. He needed the whole truth. All of it. He put everything back in the box except the ring. That he slipped into his pocket. He stood up, the study feeling too small, the air too thick to breathe. He walked out of the room, leaving the box of his discarded life sitting on the chair. He found her in the kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, as if she knew he would need it. She didn't say a word, just poured him a cup, black and strong, and gestured to a chair at the worn wooden table. Why? He asked, his voice raw, stripped of all its earlier anger. When I first came here, when you recognized me, why didn't you tell me? Martha took her time, adding a splash of milk to her own coffee before she answered. It wasn't my story to tell, Thomas. It was Eleanor's, and it was Noah's. I made a promise to her. I would wait for the right moment. And a wild horse trying to trample him was the right moment? He asked, a bitter edge to his voice. Perhaps it was the only moment we had left, she replied, her voice soft and heavy. A new, more terrible fear began to dawn on him, a fear worse than anything he had yet faced. He remembered Noah's words in the saloon, because time's running out. He looked at Martha, a silent, desperate question in his eyes. She met his gaze, and the compassion he saw there was almost more than he could bear. Eleanor didn't just come here by chance, Thomas, she said gently. She was looking for a specialist, a doctor in the next county who she thought could help. She was already very sick when she arrived. And Noah? He whispered, afraid to say the words, afraid to give voice to the terror coiling in his stomach. Martha took a deep breath. Noah is dying, Thomas. The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, meaningless and distant. Then they slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs, shattering the last fragile piece of his soul. It's the same illness that took his mother 6 months ago, Martha continued, her voice filled with a profound sorrow. It's in his lungs. The doctors here. They give him perhaps 3 months, maybe less. Another son. He had just found him, only to lose him. The universe, it seemed, was not without a sense of cruel, cosmic irony. That's why, Thomas said, the realization hitting him. That's why he asked for one day. Martha nodded, her eyes glistening. He knows. He's known for a while, and he accepts it with a grace that would put most grown men to shame. But he has one last wish, Thomas. The one thing his mother's stories couldn't give him. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle in the quiet kitchen. He wants to know his father, even if it's just for a day. Thomas stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. He paced the small kitchen like a caged animal, his hands clenched, his mind reeling. Grief and rage and a guilt so profound it threatened to swallow him whole warred within him. I can't, he finally choked out, his voice a raw whisper. He turned to face her, his eyes wild with desperation. I can't do this. I am not the man in those stories. I am not the hero he thinks I am. I will only disappoint him. I can't be what he needs. Martha watched him, her expression unchanging, her gaze steady and deep. The man I saw today, she said, her voice cutting through his panic. The man who threw himself onto a charging Mustang to save a child he didn't even know. That man is exactly what Noah needs. That was instinct, he shot back. One moment. It doesn't erase 7 years of cowardice. No, Martha agreed quietly. It doesn't, but it's a start. And right now, a start is all he's asking for. One day, Thomas. Surely you can give your son that much. The word son. It hung in the air between them, an undeniable, unbreakable bond, a responsibility he could no longer run from. He stopped pacing and stared out the kitchen window at the star-dusted sky. The same stars Eleanor had looked at, wondering where he was. The same stars she had likely pointed out to their son. Their son. What happens after? He asked, his voice barely audible. What happens after that one day? When he sees who I really am? When he needs more than I can give him? Martha walked to the sink and placed her empty cup inside. She turned back to him, her face softened by the pale moonlight streaming through the window. That, she said with a quiet certainty that left no room for argument, is a bridge you will cross when you come to it. But I have a feeling, Thomas Blackwood, that you are a much stronger man than you believe yourself to be. She left him then, alone in the quiet kitchen with the cooling coffee and the ghosts of his past and future. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small gold ring. He stared at it for a long time, the metal seeming to warm in his hand. Inside, a faint inscription was barely visible. 2 hearts, 1 path, a path he had abandoned. With a slow, deliberate movement, he slipped the ring onto the 4th finger of his left hand. It still fit. The sun had not yet risen when Thomas stood on the porch of the boarding house. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night reading Eleanor's letters, one by one, piecing together the life they had lived without him. A life of hardship, yes, but also a life filled with a love he didn't deserve. The front door creaked open behind him. He turned to see Noah standing there. The boy was dressed in his best clothes, a worn shirt that had been carefully ironed and a pair of trousers that were just a little too short. He had polished his boots. He looked like a boy preparing for the most important day of his life. Mrs. Donovan said you wanted to see me, Noah said. His voice was small, cautious, as if he was bracing himself for rejection. Thomas nodded, his own throat suddenly tight. All the words he had rehearsed in his head overnight vanished. What do you say to the son you never knew you had? The son you only have a few months to know? I've been thinking about your proposal, Thomas began, his voice rougher than he wanted. About spending a day together. A tiny flicker of hope sparked in Noah's blue eyes, but he quickly suppressed it, his face remaining a careful, neutral mask. And, Thomas continued, the words feeling both impossible and absolutely necessary, I'd like to accept, if the offer still stands. The mask on Noah's face shattered. A smile, pure and radiant, broke through like the sunrise that was just beginning to crest the mountains. It was a smile so full of hope and joy that it almost broke Thomas's heart. Really? Noah breathed, his eyes wide. You mean it? A strange thing happened. For the first time in 7 years, Thomas felt the corners of his own mouth lift into a genuine smile. It felt foreign, like a muscle he hadn't used in a long time. I do, he said, but first things first. We can't have you learning the ropes of being a cowboy without the right gear. Noah's smile faltered slightly. I don't have much money, mister. That's not your concern, Thomas said, taking a step toward him. Consider it. Part of the adoption. The word felt strange, inadequate for the truth of their situation. But Noah didn't seem to notice. His brilliant smile returned, wider than before. When do we start? He asked, his voice buzzing with an energy that seemed to fill the quiet morning. Thomas looked at the sun, its golden rays now spilling into the valley, chasing away the last of the shadows. No time like the present, he said. Let's go see what Henderson's general store has to offer. They walked down the main street together, the man who had forgotten how to live and the boy who was running out of time to do so. They were an odd pair, the tall, grim-faced stranger and the small, bright-eyed boy who walked beside him, struggling to match his long strides. It was just one day. But for both of them, it was the beginning of everything they had left. If you were moved by Thomas and Noah's story and believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that explore the deepest corners of the human heart.